Okay, hello and welcome everyone to another episode of Masculinity Unmasked, the fortnightly conversation that delves deep into what it means to be a man in the 21st century. So, the topic of conversation for today's episode is something a little bit different to what we've done so far in terms of the mindset side of things, but still very much interlinked to that. We are looking today at owning your identity online, the art of personal branding for entrepreneurs. As always, I'm joined by my co-host and fellow coach, Greg Stein. And this evening, we're very fortunate to have with us a very experienced marketeer, Daniel Williams from DTG Marketing, who is a go-to expert for entrepreneurs who want to start building a personal brand that actually works. So, Daniel, thanks very much for joining us this evening. Do you want to start by sharing a little bit about yourself and the sort of work that you do?
Well, I like to pride myself on kind of building personal brands which don't seem fake, which are actually personal. And I'm
Mhm.
renowned, Greg will tell you, for my short and mysterious answers. But that's just me. That's just me being authentic. I'm a writer, and
Yeah,
writers have to be concise, at the end of the day.
yeah, yeah,
And I don't care if people don't like that. People who I like will like that, and I'm sure that's something we'll come on to later.
yeah. Yeah, it'll be interesting to sort of delve into that. High level then, looking at the subject, what do we actually mean by personal branding for our listeners?
I think everyone has a personal brand, whether they know it or not. Like the guy in the shop who you talk to, he sees you as someone. That's your personal brand to him. It's all perspective. And in building a social media is just controlling that brand.
Mm, mm.
Stuff. Yeah, it's a good answer. Um, Dan, thank you so much for joining us on the show. I've known Dan for quite some time, and what I really like about Dan is he just sees things differently. Okay, and I thought he'd be a perfect guest in terms of us talking about personal branding. What I'm really interested in is the metaverse and the idea that we're all moving towards this online world, if you like, almost like The Sims, avatars, etc. Okay, and I openly talked to you guys before, when we come on, that when I used to employ people, CVs didn't really mean a lot to me. I would look at people's online accounts basically because I thought that all the CVs looked the same. Okay. Dan, you see things differently. Think a good place to start with is where do you think is a good place to start with your own personal branding, with your own account? Some good tips, some things that you've seen that work, some things that don't work, if you like. And the reason I ask you this is one interesting fact that me and Dan have found over the last sort of 6 months or so is that 86% of coaches quit or fail within their first year. And I would guess that most of that is due to personal branding problems. Dan, what's your thoughts on that?
I would always recommend someone go to a platform that they're kind of good at. So if you're good at speaking, go to YouTube, go to even podcast, Instagram, because obviously you're going to do best on that. And whatever you enjoy, you're going to be best at, and it's going to be sustainable. So I'd say go for that.
Mm. Yeah, that's a great tip, isn't it? Because let's lean on our skill sets. Let's think about the things that we are actually good at, and that's an easy part of the puzzle that's you can miss. And I've certainly been guilty of that as well. It's so easy, I think, to follow suit as to what other people might have done, but actually to lean into where your strengths are, and where your audience might be as well is another important point. I think we should say for the benefit of our listeners, so Daniel and Greg have done quite a lot of sort of work together on in the personal branding space, so that's how they know each other. Just for context. Um, so yeah, it's a really interesting point. So for someone that's starting out from scratch, because we're going to have a range of sort of listeners in our audience, from coaches, but also other entrepreneurs in different sectors, maybe even employees that want to brush up their LinkedIn. What would be the starting point, would you say, in terms of beginning to think about building your personal brand?
If you haven't got anything to talk about that you've done in the real world that's interesting that people are going to listen to, then there's no point building a personal brand. Because, if you're just a boring person, you're not going to do well. But you don't even have to be like an extremely accomplished guy to do this kind of thing. You could just be a guy I know me and Greg have had a client recently who's just starting out his journey, and he's had a lot of issues, and he's shared those issues, and people have got value from that, and he's built a good personal brand around that.
Mm,
So you can start at any point as long as you're kind of doing stuff that you're talking about, rather than just talking about it like you know it, but you don't. You're not even interested in it or doing it, you know?
mm,
That's a good point. That's a good point. Dan, I just love this belief, this feeling, this need for being honest, being authentic in this space. And this brings me on to my next point, and something we spoke a little bit about off there. Profile pictures, PFPs, but also how far do you go with your own stuff? Now, we had an open chat that I don't share pictures of my wife often, and I just noticed, Max, by chance, that you do the same with your life. You don't share too much of it. Lots of people do. Lots of people do share everything. For me, it's not that I don't want to show my wife off. It's the opposite. I feel protective, if you like. And that brings me back into this profile picture, these pictures, what you share. It's pretty obvious, isn't it? If you smile in your picture, you're going to get more interest. I even read something about symmetry with face pictures, that people are more inclined to go with it. But Dan, what's maybe the worst one you've seen, the funniest, the best? What's your thoughts and feelings on this? And then we can dive in a little bit deeper to some of the results we got back from the poll that we put out about this question.
I think a common theme here is the best is always what you enjoy and what you like. I think if you like smiling, smile. If you don't. It's all about it's your personal brand for a reason. It's got to be personal. Probably the best one I've seen is a guy had it upside down. That stood out to me. I think just being different is something that's massive, and it's better for you because you're enjoying your life. And you're just sharing that. It's easier, and also your audience connects with you on a deeper level, and you'll attract the people who you want to attract as well, rather than
mm.
attracting people who are attracted to someone who doesn't actually exist.
Yeah, yeah.
Good point.
So easy to get lost in what other people are doing, isn't it? That comparisonitis, I think, especially in the coaching world, but even amongst other entrepreneurs. And you get a lot of people that are a few steps ahead, saying that this worked for me, and therefore you try that. But then it might not necessarily work for you. And I guess the missing piece there is, well, you're not bringing yourself into the space. Your story, or what works for you, and what might connect with your audience. The authenticity pieces sounds to be really important. I guess how can someone lean into their authenticity when look at LinkedIn and it's just polished profiles everywhere, left, right, and center, in terms of like glossy pictures and all that sort of thing. Can we really be authentic online? Is an interesting question, right? And if so, how can we lean into that authenticity?
LinkedIn is definitely polished. It's renowned for that. I think that's what makes it great, because as soon as you become you, you're authentic, you're standing out, and you're gonna get big rewards from that,
Mhm.
That's a good point. That's a good point. That's a really interesting point about being authentic, and that leads me into questions about AI. Obviously, me and Dan, with some of the people that we work with or some people we've helped, we've noticed that followers don't really mean so much. It's more about this message that you put out, isn't it, Dan? And Dan's got a great story about signing someone off, when he first started with a small amount of followers. But it's so interesting to see how many people use AI to write, to take pictures, to even in these profile pictures and banners, Dan, you can see how many of them are edited. Or personally, I think that goes against you. What's your thoughts on this?
Well, when I started about 2 years ago, I was absolutely terrible at writing. I didn't know what to write. I didn't know how to optimize the profiles. And I kind of listened to what all the gurus were saying, all those guys with 100K followers who did it 5 years ago. And it didn't work, because it was 5 years ago that they did it. And times change, especially on social media, it's very quick. So I think just doing you, even if it doesn't maximize the amount of followers you'll maximize the quality of those followers, which you can then turn into connections and sales, which is what me and Greg do.
Mm.
Perfect. Yeah, that's absolutely perfect. Max, what's your thoughts on that?
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, we're sort of at the advent of AI, and I think most people use ChatGPT or something similar, whether it's to look up stuff or to
Yeah.
help shape, some of their content. But I think, the majority of people still want their authentic selves to, show up online despite the use of AI. So the interesting question I think is like, how do we marry the two? If AI is a sort of process management tool to help you streamline the writing of posts, that's all well and good, but how do you maintain that thread of authenticity then? Because I guess an extreme of that would be sort of ghostwriting for posts, and then the pendulum the other way would be writing every bit of content, every bit of marketing by hand yourself. And it seems like a lot of people are sort of in the middle there of that
Yeah.
pendulum swinging. But how do we find the sort of sweet spot there? Because we're busy people. There's a lot that's involved in running a business, whether it's as a coach or another entrepreneur. How do we find that balance between process management and authenticity?
I think a lot of people have woken up recently to AI not cutting it for their content. Personally, I do use it for ideation, for ideas.
Mm,
That's what it's good for at the moment. And then I write absolutely everything myself. I think
mm,
once you're kind of being your authentic self and it's coming from your heart, really, it becomes much easier to write, and you kind of you can look through the analytics, pick up what resonated, and then
mm.
share more of those kind of personal stories with your audience. I
Yeah.
think sometimes it's just trial and error. You just have to keep going. It's a long process.
Mm,
Dan, that's perfect, I think. And there's lots of interesting subjects there: resignating, being authentic, and AI. And me and Max obviously do this weekly. We speak to lots of interesting people, and there's lots of things that spring to mind, or I think that we can link to this: imposter syndrome, social comparison theory. I openly, Dan, when we talked about me failing as an original coach, a lot of that was because I was trying to be someone else. When I was myself, I found that it had a different effect, like in my job, and you can link that to imposter syndrome. Social comparison theory. How many posts do we see, Dan, which are the same to everyone else? This we've laughed a lot in the past, haven't we, about the Canva mountain with the quote, or the you know where you can see, you said about watching a guru and you've taken on their stuff and people copy. We can see this mirrored time and time again. And then you can see some of the ones that are being authentic and writing for themselves. I actually think from a sort of like psychology point of view, from a mental health point of view, that trying to be yourself in the long run will give you longevity. Coming back to that point that that 86% of coaches fail, right? If you want to have the longevity, you don't concentrate on other people. You look insular. You look at yourself and you try to resonate with those sort of types. Dan, I've got a really interesting question. Where do you see this going? Before we come on, I talked to you a bit about CVs. The idea that I stopped looking at them at a time. I was looking more at social media. Where do you see this going? And especially the development of X. I think that is changing rapidly, isn't it?
Yeah, AI is only going to get better, isn't it? So I think you've got to ask yourself, what is the point of the personal brand? I think a few years ago it might have been to share value, to share your knowledge, but at the moment or going into the future, it's more likely to be sharing your unique experiences, your personality, and putting that twist on it, because AI it doesn't have experiences, does it? And it doesn't have the
mm.
emotions that go with it. So I think that's definitely something big, and that's where I see it going, and that's why I'm leaning into it so much.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fascinating because I can really see that as well. And when I look at content, the content I engage with is that content that you can tell has really come from the heart, from that
Yeah.
person's real world. It's that relatedness, that primal drive to connect with somebody else, comes from the authenticity. Um, but you mentioned something really interesting earlier, which is, yeah, well, we look at the analytics. What analytics would you invite the listeners to begin to have a look at? Because we've got things like likes, we've got things like, on LinkedIn, how many people have clicked on a post, at interactions and things like that. What analytics are we talking about here that are most useful? to begin to break down and assess?
I think, unfortunately, the most important analytics that you can't measure. They're like trust, goodwill, connections, you know. But apart from that, the quantitative ones, I would say just look, go through your posts. You don't have to overcomplicate it. See what got the most likes from the people that you want to attract,
Mm.
and see the common themes between those posts, and then make more of them. It doesn't have to be hard, you know. You just do more of what works.
Yeah,
It's a
that's
good
great.
point. It's really interesting you talk about trust, and that's something that we've worked on a lot, isn't it, Dan? And actually, when I think about trust as well, I think about the amount of time you can spend on DMs and get lost in this, get absolutely lost in it. It can be all too consuming, can't it, Dan? Especially with some of the people that we work with or helped. And we limit ourselves, don't we? You know, I talk about having a tick box formula, a 1 hour a day tick box formula where I don't allow it to consume me. That's a serious take home that we can dive into more. Before we dive into that, Dan, I've got another really interesting question for you about chatbots. Um, I do some coaching for another company. I won't say who it is. And before the client comes into the room, they interact with a chatbot pretending to be you. The scariest thing about the chatbot is obviously it studies all of your sessions that you've done and it speaks like me, word for word. Obviously not with an accent from writing, but it uses the words that I would use, the analogies, everything. This is scary, I think, going forward in terms of DMs, in terms of like who you're talking to online. Where do you see this going, Dan? Do you think this will get out of control? Do you think that you're going to have chatbot talking to chatbot? Where's this go?
It definitely is interesting. I think I do see video content doing better soon, because obviously I'm not the
Yeah.
best at video. I'm more of a writer, so that's unfortunate for me. But that's the way the cookie crumbles sometimes. So I think chatbot to chatbot would be an interesting thing. But it kind of makes you ask the question, what's the point? What value are you getting from that?
Mm.
So maybe it'll come back down
The
soon. I
reason
don't
we
know.
ask is we've seen this on my ex in particular, Dan, haven't we? Where I know I'm talking to AI almost like you're dropping into a DM strategy that me and Dan have honed, and we talk to other people openly about it, and then it clicks that you're not talking to a person. You're talking to an AI chatbot over X, and that for me is quite scary. I think that what is that going to move into? Actually, best way I can recognize it is when you go on internet banking, and before you go into your bank, you have the chatbot before, and it has a list of questions for you. Before you speak to a person. That's where we're going with this. ManyChat, for example, is the one of the automated systems, isn't it? Do you think this is too dangerous? Do you think we need? I think we need to try and move away from this, Dan. But where do you see? Do you see X taking over everything with this? I've got a feeling it might. What's your thoughts?
I think if you want to reach a lot of people fast and try and make as many connections as possible, then AI is for you. But if you want to reach the few people that will buy and make genuine connections with them, and build a successful business partnership, clients, then it's got to be coming from you, and you can only do so many people with that. And
Mm.
you've got to balance out the quantity with the quality.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so true. I can relate to that in my own experience speaking to people and having people speak to me, and it is that no like trusting that you talked about earlier on, that is the connecting piece. So the more that we lose that, I fear that the less connection we're going to have. Um, and you mentioned video there as being particularly important at the moment, and I've heard other people say that. What is it about now, do you think, is the reason why video is becoming so important as an entrepreneur showing up on social media?
I think video just gives that extra element of personal, personal like interaction, which is what people are craving at the moment with, AI. They can get any sort of information they want from that. They just
Mm,
want the personality twist on top of that. And
mm,
that's where I see it going, to be honest.
It's a
mm,
good point. I think actually, me and Dan run studies by the way, not just on X or LinkedIn, but across them all, TikTok, Instagram. You'll be amazed at the analytics for TikTok, isn't it, Dan? It's incredible how many views you can get compared to writing on LinkedIn or Twitter, for example. And I feel like, yeah, it's that drive, that want, that need, isn't it? interact with something like that, which is human.
Mm,
Max, I've got a question for you.
mm,
Obviously, me and you were in the coaching space, and I openly talked about not sharing pictures of my wife, for example, not
mm.
because I don't want to show her off, more the fact that I'm nervous or protective. What's your thoughts on this? How far do you go, or do you keep it for when you get to know people? What's your style with that? Because I think people will listen to this and think, actually, it's what I need to do, or that sounds good, or would work for me, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
I think it's a really great question. I think it's a delicate dance, right? Because I think people want to know you, that they want to like you, and they want to trust you. And to do those three things, you have to show up in a way that, displays some personal elements of your life in terms of your personality. For example, your thoughts around things, your stance on certain topics, whatever it is. So you're showing up in that way that is demonstrating those more personal elements. But does that mean then you would need to, show all areas of your life to your audience for them to engage? And I don't think it does from my experience. I mean, I sometimes bring in um, other parts of my life where I feel like the post would serve my audience. Um, but I don't do it in the way that this is how you can get to know me. Do you see what I mean? And I think there's a
Yeah.
difference between that. So, for example, my dog, it was it was International Pet Day or something like that the other day, Appreciation Day, and I did a post with my dog. And I did that post actually because I saw that it was that day, and I just felt like it felt true to me to do that because I do really appreciate my dog, and there's lots of lessons. I know that sounds silly, but there's lots of lessons that he's taught me, and people loved it, and I think they loved it because obviously he's cute. It's a cute picture, but also it's showing up, as not just this coach who knows X, Y, and Z about these topics and is here to help, but also somebody, a human being with a life. So I think, as I said at the beginning, I think it's like a delicate dance. I think it's okay to introduce it, but I don't think it needs to be the feature necessarily. And I think it's subjective. Some people don't want to bring their their partners into it, their children into it, even their pets into it, because they want to keep that separate. And I think you can, from
Absolutely.
my experience, Daniel's obviously the expert, but from my experience, you can still excel and exceed as an entrepreneur without having to do that as well. Um, in the space. I'm really curious, Daniel. So if somebody wanted to come and do some work with you on personal branding, they're sort of starting from scratch. What's the sort of journey that you would take them on then in a sort of um, high level way? If you're okay to sort of take us through that.
Obviously, I'm a big advocate of authenticity, so I would always go and question them as much as possible. It doesn't matter if it takes long, if it takes an extra week for us to start. You've got to kind of get that brand voice nailed and who you want to attract as well,
Mm,
with your personality. At the moment, me and Greg are running a coaching program. So what we do is, I for the first couple of weeks would experiment with what kind of posts do well for this
yeah.
guy and what he's the audience he's trying to attract. Um, See what posts do well, and then kind of teach him to do more of those posts that do well in
Mm,
his voice. And because obviously, even if I'm the expert, he's better than me at being him at the end of the day,
mm.
and that's what a personal brand is all about.
Okay. And just so that this is the case, so doing well, is that looking at those quantitative metrics, the more subjective metrics like trust, etc., or both?
I'd say if a post is attracting the people you want it to attract in big numbers, it's doing well.
Okay.
Good point. I've got one last question for you guys, actually, something that we spoke about a little bit online, but I think it leads in well to what you just said, Dan. And you call it the delicate dance. I think that's the best way to put it, Max.
Mm,
There's someone that me and Max have in common. I'm not going to tell you who he is. And I saw something on his LinkedIn earlier where he's shown a very delicate picture of his honeymoon. I think he was called out for it on his LinkedIn over the post that he said and where he went, that is the delicate dance, isn't it? How far do you go with this? Let's say, Dan, we want our listeners to have a real take home. Do you take the risk and you be authentic and you put those posts out, or do you be reserved and play it like everyone else? What's your thoughts?
What I'd say is kind of approach it like you're approaching someone in real life. So it is a stranger at the end of the day, stranger danger, but they are someone who's interested in you. And at the end of the day, you've got to kind of balance the authenticity with not sharing too much. Like you wouldn't go up to a stranger and say, "Look, here's my wife." It's kind of too
Mm,
much, isn't it? So it's getting that balance, as with a lot of these things.
It's a
mm,
good answer. Yes. So I think it's, the idea of playing it safe. And actually, Max, the best advice I give to anyone when it comes to me with my own personal brand is what Dan was like. He kept me accountable, if that makes sense. And I was so nervous about putting myself out there to start off with, if that makes sense. And you second guess yourself. I don't like my
mm,
accent. I don't like the way I look. I don't like certain things about that. And actually, it took someone like Dan to be like, actually, go for it. Do it. That's good. That doesn't work. That is priceless, by the way. Priceless.
mm.
And that's why coaching is so valuable, isn't it? From every point of view, is to actually just ask for a second opinion sometimes. I think that's the most valuable aspect with this.
Yeah, it all comes back to that relatability point, doesn't it? I mean,
Yes.
and I'll bring up her quote again. I think I brought it up on one of our earlier episodes, but I think it rings really true. Vulnerability is the last thing that I I want you to see in me, but the first thing that I look for in you. And how that links to this is, when we're looking at people's posts, we are looking at those vulnerable stories, those journeys that people have gone on, and how they've come up the other end, right? And that's how we connect to their story and want to work with people, because we know that they've been on that journey. They can do the things, they've done the work themselves. It takes us showing up almost in a vulnerable way sometimes as well, not even just or authentic way, and that can be a challenge. And I think someone wise said to me, tell from the scar rather than the wound when you're telling your stories. Share what you can share comfortably. But sometimes, again, that's a bit of a dance, isn't it? If you're really wanting to help an audience, you may share some quite deep stuff, and how to navigate that in terms of what you're happy to share. So I think it's like checking in with yourself constantly, isn't it? Where do you sit? We've talked a lot about balance and sitting in between in the pendulum. And I think sounds like it goes for all of this stuff, whether it's authenticity, whether it's AI, whether it's vulnerability. Um, having that felt sense, growing that felt sense of actually what feels right for
Absolutely.
you. Yeah.
That's a great answer. There's one tip, isn't there, Dan, that I've told everyone that I work with is check it once, don't check it again. Because you second guess yourself, if that makes sense. Look at it once, make a decision whether it's right or wrong. If you have any that feeling that it's wrong, don't put it out. But if
Mm,
you think it's right, go for it, but then don't look at it again. I find like
I like that.
that's the sweet spot almost is but that's why having someone like Dan is priceless, by the way.
Mm,
Just having someone go, Greg, that's okay, that's okay, put it out, or take a risk as well, which is even better. And I think everyone could do with that.
yeah. So for our listeners at home then, who, maybe at different stages with this, they might be working with somebody already, they might be right at the beginning of their journey with personal branding. Are there any other key takeaways that either of you would give to those people listening as to, how to get started with personal brand, how to approach authenticity, anything you feel like we haven't covered that would be useful to share with them?
I would just say just post. Like at the worst case is your Twitter post doesn't do well. Like it doesn't matter if you're not going to remember it in a year, then don't worry about it now. That's what
Mm,
I think. And I also think, linking back to the masculinity, men do feel a lot of pressure to look successful online with their
mm,
status, money, physique, and stuff like that. But everyone is trying to look successful instead of actually be successful, and it's taking everyone down. And if you're just being authentic, you're saying, "Look, I'm not where I want to be yet, but I'm going there." You're going to
mm,
attract a lot more people than you would by just, posting a picture of a pink Lamborghini in Dubai. Uh,
mm.
yeah, I think it's sort of a shame that people are trying to look successful and not be successful.
Yeah, that's so true. And it's alienating, really, isn't it? A lot of people.
Absolutely. And actually, I don't know, a trend that is starting to happen. People are starting to call these people out. I've seen that a lot as well. That is trending, by the way, is these people calling out the so-called gurus. So I think authenticity now is the key, isn't it? It's just being honest. Just
Mm,
being honest.
mm.
And I think that's healthy. As much as I'm worried about some aspects of AI and metaverse, exactly, etc., I think that's healthy.
One thing we haven't capped off that I imagine the listeners might be wanting to ask then is like, talked about posting. What about frequency? Just to tick it off, is there a sort of a right or a wrong with that? Or is it sort of yeah, check in with you. What are your thoughts on that, Daniel?
Well, at the start, the more you post, the more you'll fail, but then the more lessons you'll learn as well. I
Mm,
think there is a point where there's too much posting. You're just going to spam people like 10 Instagram posts a day. It's a waste of your time and it's a waste of the people who are trying to watch you's time.
mm,
It's getting that balance between learning as many lessons as possible and not spending too much time on it and kind of doing stuff in the real world, which links
mm.
back to what I said at the start is you've got to have stuff to talk about. You can't just talk about stuff that you haven't done.
Yeah, that balance piece came in again there at the
Yeah.
end. Great stuff. Okay. Well, thank you very much, both of you. Thank you for delving into this topic. It's been great to get stuck in and hear your thoughts. And thanks everyone for listening today. So, Daniel, if people would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
You can DM me on Twitter. You can be one of the few authentic people that DM me at Dan Williams DTG.
Okay. Um, so if anyone resonates with the topic today, or anything that we've shared, please do reach out. And we'd love to hear from you. And in our next conversation on the 16th of March, we are having a look at a different topic entirely, although again, interlinked, which is vulnerability in leadership with Simon Tompkins. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Take care.